He grabbed her laptop off the desk and hurled it against the wall. The screen shattered. 3 weeks of work gone in 2 seconds. Imani Bellrose didn't flinch. She'd learned not to flinch around men like Kwon Tae-hyun. Flinching was an admission that he had power over you, and she refused to give him that. Even here, even now, even with armed guards standing 20 feet from the door. "You think this is a game," he said. His voice was dangerously quiet. He crossed the room toward her and stopped close enough that she could see the tension locked in his jaw. "You think because you found a number in a spreadsheet, you understand something about my world." Imani held his stare. "I understand $40 million doesn't move itself." He leaned in until the space between them was nothing. "You belong beside me on this," he said. "Not fighting me. Beside me. Do you understand the difference?" She did understand. That was the problem, because 3 weeks ago, she had been a forensic accountant with a filing deadline and a cold cup of coffee. Now she was standing inside a mafia boss's waterfront estate, watching him try to turn her into something she had never planned to become. And the most terrifying part wasn't the guards outside. It was the moment, brief, unwanted, impossible to take back, when she had kissed him anyway. If you've ever been in a situation where every exit was locked and the only person who could help you was the one who trapped you there, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because this moment didn't happen overnight. It was built, piece by piece, over 3 weeks that changed everything. The night it started, Seattle was doing what Seattle does in October, raining like it had a personal grievance. Imani was alone in the 4th floor records room at Caldwell and Pell Financial Consulting, which was not unusual. She worked late most Thursdays. The office cleared out by 6. The cleaning crew came through at 7, and by 8, the building was hers. She liked it that way. Quiet made her sharper. She'd been hired to audit Hanuel Pacific Group's quarterly statements, a standard due diligence review, before a proposed merger with a Portland-based logistics firm. Routine work. She'd done 100 like it, except that nothing about Hanuel Pacific's books was routine. She'd noticed the first anomaly 3 days earlier, a wire transfer routed through a subsidiary in Singapore that didn't appear on the consolidated balance sheet. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking. Large enough to matter if you were. She'd flagged it internally and kept pulling threads. Tonight she found where the threads led. $40 million. Moved across 11 shell corporations in 4 countries over 18 months. The transactions were structured to look like intercompany loans, freight settlements, real estate acquisitions, the kind of layered misdirection that took serious expertise to construct. Whoever built this system knew exactly how auditors thought. They'd designed it to survive a standard review. It didn't survive Imani. She sat back in her chair and stared at the screen for a long moment. Her coffee had gone cold. The rain was hitting the window in gusts. She pulled up the ownership records on Hanuel Pacific's parent entity. The name that came back was Kwon Tae-hyun. She knew the name. Seattle's financial and business community knew the name. Kwon Tae-hyun was a Korean-born international businessman shipping, logistics, commercial estate who'd built a legitimate-looking American empire from the waterfront up over the past decade. He appeared at charity auctions. He sat on a port development advisory board. His company's PR materials described him as a visionary entrepreneur committed to Pacific Rim trade development. Imani had seen men like this before. The money was always cleaner than the man. She started cross-referencing the shell corporations against publicly available shipping manifests and port authority records. That was when the second thing hit her. The financial trail wasn't just laundering. It was a weapon. The $40 million was being positioned, account by account, to dismantle the liquidity structure of a competing operation. She recognized the target entity's holding pattern. She'd seen it before in a different audit 2 years ago. Cormac Delaney, Seattle's port operations. A name that moved through the financial underworld like smoke. Everyone knew it was there. No one could quite get a grip on it. She was still processing what she was looking at when her phone rang. Graham Pell, her supervisor, at 10:47 on a Thursday night. she answered. Imani. His voice had a tightness she'd never heard before. I need you to step away from the Hanul Pacific file. She sat forward slowly. Graham, I'm in the middle of I know what you're in the middle of. Step away from it. Tonight, don't save anything new. Don't send anything. Just close it out and go home. The line between professional instruction and something else had just been crossed. She could feel it. There's a $40 million discrepancy in this audit, she said carefully. I'm obligated to Imani. His voice dropped. I'm asking you to trust me on this one. Walk away. She sat with that for a second. I'll talk to you in the morning, she said, and ended the call. She didn't walk away. She copied everything onto an encrypted drive, sent a preliminary summary to her personal secure server, and spent another 40 minutes following the offshore trail as far as it went. Town Metairie. By the time she shut the computer down, she had enough to understand the shape of what she was looking at, even if she didn't yet understand all of it. She took the elevator down to the parking garage at midnight. The garage was empty. Her car was on level 2, tucked into her usual spot near the stairwell. She heard her own footsteps on the concrete and the distant sound of water running through the drainage pipes overhead. She got her keys out. 2 men stepped out from between the parked cars before she reached the driver's side door. They weren't threatening. They didn't touch her. One of them simply said, Mr. Kwon would like to speak with you, in a calm, neutral tone, and the black SUV already idling at the end of the row told her the conversation was going to happen, whether she cooperated or not. Imani looked at the stairwell door, looked at the SUV, thought through the geometry of the situation. Then she got in the vehicle. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was. But running, without knowing what she was running from, felt stupider than finding out what she was dealing with. The drive took 22 minutes. She counted. The estate was on the waterfront south of the city, set back from the road, behind a perimeter wall, approached through a gate where 2 more men checked the vehicle without speaking. The main house was large and deliberately understated from the outside, which Imani recognized as its own kind of statement. Men who needed to prove power put it on the exterior. Men who actually had it didn't bother. She was taken through a side entrance and into a room that functioned as an office, bookshelves along one wall, a wide desk, a conference table, no windows. Imani noted the exits. 1 door she'd come through, 1 other door on the far wall, both guarded. She sat in the chair they indicated and did not allow herself to look like she was cataloging the room. She was absolutely cataloging the room. Kwon Tae-hyun came in without announcement. He was taller than she'd expected from the photographs, built with the kind of controlled physical stillness that came from discipline rather than relaxation. 41, though he looked slightly younger. His suit was off, jacket gone, shirt collar open. He'd been working late too. His face was harder in person than in press photos. The PR polish that photographers captured in his public appearances was entirely absent here. He looked at her the way people look at a situation they need to solve. Miss Bellrose, he said. He sat down across the conference table from her without extending a hand. I apologize for the circumstances. You apologize, she repeated. It wasn't my preferred method of arranging a conversation. What was your preferred method? Because I'm not sure you ever planned to have one. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something adjacent to both. He placed a folder on the table and slid it across to her. She opened it. Graham Pell's signature was on a consulting agreement with a holding company that traced back to Hanul Pacific. The date started 4 years ago. The payments were quarterly and substantial. Your supervisor, Tae-hyun said, has been on retainer with my organization for 4 years. He alerted me the moment you flagged the audit. Imani set the folder down. She did not allow herself any visible reaction, because she needed a moment to process what she was actually feeling, which was a particular kind of cold fury, the kind you got when someone you'd trusted had been quietly lying to your face for years. He told you to stop me, she said. He said you wouldn't stop. He was right. Tae-hyun leaned back. Yes, which creates a problem. For you. For both of us, he said. You've built a record that, in the wrong hands, would expose an operation I've spent 3 years constructing. The target of that operation, Cormac Delaney, is not a man who responds well to exposure. If Delaney learns that you've traced the financial structure, he will assume you're working for my competition and act accordingly. I'm a forensic accountant, Imani said. I was doing an audit. Delaney won't care about that distinction. She looked at him directly. So what do you actually want from me? He held her gaze. The security flaw you identified, there's a gap in the transfer authorization structure. It needs to be closed before the operation completes. You're the only person who found it, which means you're the only person who fully understands where it is. You want me to fix the thing I broke open. I want you to protect the integrity of a financial structure that took 3 years to build, he said. And in exchange, I will ensure that no record of your involvement tonight leaves this room. Imani was quiet for a moment, and if I refuse? The silence that followed was not comfortable. It wasn't threatening either, exactly. It was the silence of a man who had thought through the answer to that question well before she asked it. Then you become a loose end, he said, and I don't leave those. It wasn't a threat delivered with heat. That was what made it worse. It was a statement of operational reality, delivered as matter-of-factly as a weather report. Imani exhaled slowly through her nose. I want to see the full transaction architecture, she said. Everything. Not a summary, the actual structure. He didn't blink. Agreed. And I want to understand what Delaney actually did. Something shifted in Tae-hyun's expression then, barely perceptible. Tightening around the eyes. A shift in the line of his jaw. Delaney's men killed my younger brother, he said. 6 months ago. In a parking structure in Busan. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed for endurance rather than disclosure. Flat. Contained. He was 27. He had nothing to do with my operations. He was a musician. The room was very quiet after that. Imani didn't say she was sorry. People in situations like this didn't need condolences. They needed to see that someone had actually heard them. I'll look at the structure, she said. The guards outside the door remained where they were. The second exit stayed locked, and Imani Bellrose, forensic accountant, understood with complete clarity that she was not leaving this estate tonight. Possibly not for a while. She opened the laptop they brought her, pulled up the first layer of the financial architecture, and started working because that was what she did when the walls closed in. She worked. She found the edges of things. She followed the numbers until they told the truth. She didn't know yet that the truth was going to be something none of them had anticipated. She didn't know yet what Graham had actually done. She didn't know that the 40 million was never Tae-hyun's weapon at all. But she would. The first week Imani slept 4 hours a night. Not because they wouldn't let her sleep. Tae-hyun had assigned her a room on the second floor, sparse but clean, with a window that looked out over the water and a lock on the inside that she tested twice before she believed it worked. The guards didn't come in. Nobody bothered her between midnight and 7 in the morning. She slept 4 hours because her mind wouldn't stop running the numbers. The financial architecture Tae-hyun had built over 3 years was genuinely impressive, and she hated that she could appreciate that. 11 entities across 4 jurisdictions, each one feeding into the next in a sequence designed to survive a mid-level regulatory review. The intercompany structures were clean. The beneficial ownership was buried 4 layers deep. Whoever had built the initial skeleton understood how financial investigators actually worked. They'd anticipated the standard queries and routed around them. But the execution was imperfect. There were gaps. There were always gaps because human beings built these systems, and human beings had blind spots, and blind spots were what Imani found for a living. She mapped them out by hand. In a notebook she kept face down when she wasn't writing in it. By day 3, she knew exactly where the vulnerability was. She didn't tell Tae-hyun. She told him she needed more time. He looked at her across the conference table with those dark, controlled eyes and said, "How much more time?" Not a question. Parameter request. "Another week," she said. He studied her face for a moment. She kept her expression neutral. He said, "Fine," and left the room. She went back to her notebook and kept working. The things she hadn't told him, The thing she was still trying to understand herself was that the vulnerability wasn't just a technical flaw. Structural. Fixing it properly would require reauthorizing the entire transfer sequence, which meant new digital signatures on several key transactions. Whose signatures those would need to be was a problem she was circling carefully, because the answer kept pointing somewhere she didn't want it to point. On day 5, Seo Junho brought her lunch. Junho was Tae-hyun's head of security, a quiet, compact man in his mid-40s, who moved through the estate like someone who'd spent decades being invisible in dangerous rooms. He didn't talk much. He communicated primarily through the angle of his body and the direction of his attention, and Imani, who read people professionally, found him more readable than he probably intended. He set the tray down on the corner of the desk without comment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Someone has to," he said. "You haven't eaten since this morning." "I'm not hungry." "That's not what I said." He didn't move toward the door. Imani looked up at him. "Is this the part where you tell me things will go easier if I cooperate?" Junho's expression didn't change. "No. This is the part where I tell you that the soup gets cold fast and it's better hot." He paused. "Also that you should be careful how long you let him believe you're making progress when you're actually stalling." She went very still. "He's patient," Junho continued. "But he reads people. It's how he's survived as long as he has." He looked at her steadily. "Whatever you're holding back, Ms. Bellrose, I'd recommend you calculate how long you have before he works it out himself." He left. Imani stared at the soup for a long time before she picked up the spoon. That evening, Tae-hyun came in after 9. He did this, sometimes appeared in the doorway of the working room when most of the staff had gone quiet and the estate had settled into its night rhythm. He'd pour himself a coffee from the carafe she'd stopped. Noticing was always refilled, and sometimes he'd stand at the window. Sometimes he'd sit at the far end of the conference table with a tablet and work in silence on his end while she worked west on hers. They'd developed an accidental rhythm. She didn't like that they had one. Tonight he sat and said nothing for almost 20 minutes. "Then you used to work at the SEC." She didn't look up. "Did you run a background check before or after you had your men intercept me in a parking garage?" "Before. Obviously." "Obviously," she repeated. "You left after 2 years." "The work was the same," she said. "The politics were different." "You didn't like the politics." "I didn't like being told to stop before I finished." She finally looked at him. "Turns out that's a recurring theme in my professional life." He almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction, and then stopped, like he'd caught it in time. "Why forensic accounting?" he said. "Why organized crime?" she said back. The almost smile appeared again. Same length, same controlled abort. He looked at his coffee. "My father built 3 legitimate businesses," he said. "All of them were destroyed by men like Delaney. Men who understood that the law only protects you if you have the resources and to invoke it." He set the cup down. "I decided resources were more reliable than laws." "That's a clean story," Imani said. "Easy to believe." "You don't believe it?" "I believe it's true," she said. "I don't believe it's complete." The quiet between them was different after that. It had more weight in it. She turned back to her screen. He went back to his tablet. The rain came back outside, slower than the night she'd arrived, more methodical. She did not tell him she was starting to find the silences easier than she wanted to. By the end of the first week, she'd mapped the entire vulnerability and knew exactly how to close it. By the end of the second week, she understood something that changed the architecture of every problem she'd been working on. The transfer of authorization structure required assigning authority on the final movement of the transaction to plate Tae-hyun's financial trap against Delaney and lock $40 million in a position Delaney couldn't recover from, without exposing himself to a cascade of regulatory scrutiny. The signing authority couldn't be Tae-hyun. His name anywhere near the authorization would create a discoverable link that a competent federal investigator would find within 6 months. The structure needed a neutral professional's signature. Someone with legitimate forensic accounting credentials. Someone whose authorization would read to any outside examiner as a standard verification approval. Someone like Imani. She found it on a Tuesday. She sat with it for 6 hours before she let herself fully process what she was looking at. If this operation collapsed, if Delaney's people traced it, if federal investigators ever pulled the thread, every authorization trail led to one name, one professional credential, one person who would look to any outside examiner like the rogue accountant who'd laundered $40 million through 11 shell corporations across 4 countries. Tae-hyun would be insulated. He always was. That was the point of the structure. Imani would face federal prosecution. She closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it. Then she picked up her notebook and stared at the wall for a very long time. She thought about the parking garage. She thought about Graham's voice on the phone step away from it. Imani, trust me on this one. And the sick sliding sensation of realizing that trust had been a performance for years. She thought about the way Tae-hyun had looked when he said his brother's name, the way his jaw had locked down around the grief and refused to let it move. None of it changed what was on the screen. She waited until the following morning when Tae-hyun came into the working room at 7:30 with 2 coffees and his usual unreadable expression, and she turned the laptop around and showed him. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for long enough that she knew he'd already understood it within the first 10 seconds and was now deciding how to respond. This was the structure when we began, he said. I know you were always going to be the signing authority. That was the design. I know that too, she said. I'm asking you to tell me it wasn't your idea. He met her eyes and didn't answer. The silence was its own answer. Not a complete one. She could see from his face that the situation was more complicated than simple calculation, but enough. Enough to tell her that when this started, she had been a solution to a structural problem, not a person he'd considered. Get out, she said quietly. Imani, get out of this room. He left. She sat alone for an hour. She didn't cry. She was too angry to cry and too tired to be properly furious, which left her in a particular of cold, clear-headed place that she'd learned to recognize as the state she was most dangerous in. She started thinking about exits. Not physical ones. She'd mapped those in the first 3 days and understood they weren't viable. The perimeter was monitored. The vehicles were controlled. And even if she got off the property, she had no phone, no verified connection to anyone who wasn't already compromised. And a supervisor on a criminal payroll who'd sent her here like a package to be managed. She needed a different kind of exit. She was still building it in her head when Tae-hyun came back 2 hours later. He didn't knock. He stood in the doorway and looked at her across the room with an expression that she hadn't seen on him before, something stripped of the operational control he usually wore like a second skin. It was the structure before I knew who you were, he said. I'm telling you that because it's true. It's not an excuse. No, she said. It's not. When Graham gave me your name, you were a credential. Professional profile. He stayed in the doorway. Didn't move toward her. That changed when he didn't answer immediately. The question seemed to cost him something. The third night, he said, you told Jun-ho the soup was fine, but the coffee was terrible and you needed a different brand. And then you went back to the screen and kept working for 4 more hours. He paused. I don't know what that moment was. I know it was a moment. Imani looked at him for a long time. That doesn't fix the structure, she said. No, he said, it doesn't. My name is on those authorizations. If this goes wrong, I go to prison. Yes. And you walk. He was quiet. That's what the structure does, she said. That's what you built. I know what I built, he said. His voice had something raw at the edges that she hadn't heard before. Not guilt, exactly. She wasn't sure he did guilt in any conventional form, but something that recognized the weight of what he'd done without dressing it up. I'm telling you I understand what it means. Understanding it isn't the same as changing it. No, he said, it isn't. She stood up, crossed the room. Stopped 3 feet from him because she needed him to see her face clearly when she said what came next. If you want me to keep working, she said, then we change the structure. My name comes out. Every authorization, every verification signature, every trace. Gone. And I don't care how long it takes or how complicated it makes your operation. His jaw tightened. That would require reauthorizing the entire transfer sequence, he said. I know. It would take time we may not have. Delaney's been moving. There's activity in his port accounts that suggests he's preparing to shift liquidity. If we lose the window, then you lose the window, Imani said. Make your choice. The space between them was very small. The estate was quiet around them mid-morning. Most of the staff occupied elsewhere, guards at their posts, and not pay attention to a conversation happening in an interior room with no windows. Tae-hyun looked at her. Not the operational look, the other one. The one that had started appearing in the last few days, when he thought she wasn't noticing. I'll have Junho begin the reauthorization protocol, he said. She nodded, turned to go back to the desk. Imani. She stopped. I don't ask for things, he said. I don't have much practice with it. But I'm asking you, not ordering, asking to believe that I'm not the man who put you in this position on purpose. She was quiet for a moment with her back to him. I don't know what you are yet, she said. I'm still working on that. She sat back down and opened the laptop. He left. She realized her hands were not entirely steady on the keyboard, and she was not going to examine why. The reauthorization took 4 days, and it was brutal long sessions rebuilding the signing chain, replacing her credentials with anonymized verification nodes that would hold up to scrutiny without leading anywhere discoverable. Tae-hyun worked alongside her for most of it. This was new. Before, he'd review what she produced and ask questions. Now he sat at the adjacent workstation and built sections of the structure himself, and she could see that his understanding of the financial architecture was genuinely sophisticated, not just strategic overview. You built the original structure yourself, she said on the second day. Not a question. Most of it, he said without looking up. I had a technical consultant for the Singapore routing. The rest I designed. That's not something most people in your position would do. Most people in my position trust the wrong people, he said. I prefer to understand what I'm signing my name to. She thought about that for a moment. Except this time you were planning to sign my name to it. He stopped typing. Yes, he said. Except for that, he turned and looked at her directly. I'm not going to keep apologizing for it if the apology means nothing without the action. It doesn't, she said. Then let me finish rebuilding it. She turned back to her screen. They worked in silence for another 6 hours. At midnight, Junho appeared in the doorway with 2 bottles of water and the expression of a man observing something he didn't entirely know what to do with, then disappeared again without comment. By the end of the 2nd day, her name was gone from the authorization chain. By the end of the 4th, the structure was rebuilt. The transfer was rescheduled. The window was still open barely. Delaney hadn't moved yet. That evening, Imani was alone in the working room when she made the decision she hadn't told Tae-hyun she was going to make. A secondary channel in the system, quiet, nested 3 levels below the main transaction architecture, invisible unless you were looking specifically for it. She built a backdoor not into the transfer itself, but into the evidentiary layer underneath it. Trigger that, if activated, would push Delaney's shipping records, payroll data, and offshore account history directly to a federal investigative server she had identified through public registry records. It wasn't part of the plan. Tae-hyun didn't know about it. If he found it, she wasn't certain how he'd react. She built it anyway because she'd stopped trusting that anyone in this building had a plan for what happened after the operation completed, and she had no intention of emerging from 3 weeks inside a waterfront estate with nothing and a man's word between her and a federal indictment. She was still finishing the final routing when she heard the door open behind her. Closed the secondary channel, turned around. Tae-hyun stood in the doorway. He looked at the screen, then at her, and she watched him read the micro-expression on her face that she hadn't been fast enough to erase that half-second of caught doing something that even trained professionals couldn't entirely suppress. What were you working on, he said. Checking the verification nodes, she said. 3rd layer had a timing discrepancy. He looked at the screen again, then at her again. The silence stretched. The transfer executes at midnight in 4 days, he said. I know. If everything holds, Delaney loses his liquidity position within 72 hours. His organization will begin fracturing within a week. By the time federal investigators get interested, there won't be enough left of his operation to mount a defense. And your brother gets justice, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something like it. And me, she said. What happens to me after midnight? He crossed the room to the window, stood with his back to her, looking at the water. I told you I was going to ensure no record of your involvement leaves this estate. That was week 1, she said. Week 1. I was a credential you needed. Things are different now, and you know they're different. And I'm asking you to tell me what happens to me when this is over. He turned from the window. The look on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen from him since the moment he'd said his brother's name. Something was working behind his eyes that he hadn't decided what to do with yet. I don't know, he said. It sounded like it cost him something to admit. That's the honest answer. I don't know how to give you back the life you had before the parking garage. I don't know how to undo what Graham put in motion. I know that Delaney is the most immediate threat to you, and that while he's operational, you cannot simply walk out of here and go back to your apartment. But after, she said. After, he said and stopped. After, she repeated quieter. He crossed the room. Stopped in front of her. Close the same distance as that first night, when he'd leaned in and told her she belonged beside him on this, and she'd held his stare because flinching was giving him power she refused to surrender. This was different. He wasn't projecting force at her. He was standing in front of her without it, which was somehow more difficult to handle than anything else he'd done. I don't want to lose you, he said. That's what I know. It's not everything you need to hear. I understand that. His jaw worked. But it's what's true. Imani looked at him. She thought about the parking garage. She thought about Graham. She thought about 4 days of sitting next to this man rebuilding a financial structure. Because he'd decided she mattered more than the operation's original design. She thought about the back door she'd just built into his system without telling him, because she still wasn't sure she could afford to trust him completely. She was still thinking when the gap between them closed. She didn't know afterward who moved first. She suspected it was her. She suspected it because she was the one who'd made the calculation, who'd felt the decision, forming the way she felt of a financial discrepancy before she could fully articulate it. Some part of her mind finishing the equation before the rest of her caught up. His hands came up and he held her face with something that was careful and completely at odds with everything he was, and she understood in that moment that this was a man who was far more dangerous when he was being gentle than when he was being controlled. She pulled back after a moment. Both of them were breathing differently. That doesn't fix anything, she said. No, he said. We still don't know what happens after midnight. No, he said again, and I still don't entirely trust you. I know, he said, I know that. She took a step back, looked at him with clear eyes. Then we finish the operation, she said. And then we figure out the rest. He nodded. She turned back to the laptop. Her pulse was still running faster than she wanted it to, and she was not going to look at him again for at least 10 minutes. And the secondary back door she'd built was still live underneath the main architecture, waiting because trust, even the kind that had started growing in the space between midnight coffees and rebuilt authorization chains, had to be earned in layers, and she wasn't there yet. She pulled up the transfer schedule. 4 days to midnight. Somewhere in the estate, a phone rang twice and went quiet. Neither of them knew it was Graham. Neither of them knew that the 40 million had never belonged to Tae-hyun's operation, at all that it had been moved, quietly and over years, by a man they both thought they understood, for reasons that were about to detonate everything they'd spent 3 weeks building. But the clock was running, and there was no version of the next 4 days that left any of them exactly where they'd started. The phone that rang twice and went quiet belonged to Junho. He came to find Tae-hyun at 6 the following morning, before the rest of the estate was properly awake, and the expression on his face told Tae-hyun everything he needed to know about the quality of the news before a single word was spoken. Delaney moved 48 hours early, Junho said. He kept his voice low, even though the corridor was empty. Not his liquidity position. Something else. He's been running surveillance on 3 properties connected to our holding structure. Tae-hyun was dressed but hadn't slept. He'd spent most of the night at his desk reviewing the transfer timeline and not thinking about what had happened in the working room, which meant he'd spent most of the night thinking about exactly that. Which properties, he said. Junho named them. 2 commercial real estate holdings and a freight forwarding address used as a registered agent for one of the Singapore entities. The freight address was 2 layers removed from anything that should have been traceable back to Hanyul Pacific. How did he find the freight address? Tae-hyun said. That's what I'm trying to work out. Junho's jaw was tight. It's not in any of the documentation Ms. Bellrose has been working from. It's older infrastructure, pre-operation. Tae-hyun was quiet for a moment. Who has access to pre-operation infrastructure? Junho didn't answer immediately. That pause was its own answer. Find out, Tae-hyun said. He went down the corridor to the working room. Imani was already there. She'd beaten him in again. She'd been doing since the second week, arriving before 7 with the particular focus of someone who used work as a way to keep the rest of their thoughts organized. She looked up when he came in, read something in his face, and set her coffee down. What happened? She said. Delaney is moving faster than projected. He sat across from her. He has surveillance on properties connected to the holding structure. Infrastructure that shouldn't be visible to him. Imani was very still. How old is the infrastructure? 3 years. Before the operation was fully designed. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. That's not something he could find by tracing what I've been working on. No, which means someone gave it to him. Yes. She absorbed that. He watched her process it the way her eyes moved slightly, running through the roster of people who had operational knowledge, eliminating, narrowing. Who knew about the pre-operation structure, she said. 4 people, he said. Juno myself, the Singapore consultant who is currently in Singapore and has been for 6 weeks. And Graham Pell. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Imani picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, set it back down. Graham's been on your payroll for 4 years. Yes. And he knew about infrastructure from 3 years ago. He was involved in the early structural design, in a limited capacity. He introduced me to the Singapore consultant. She looked at him directly. And he called me the night I found the audit discrepancy and told me to walk away. Yes. So either he panicked and was trying to protect your operation, she said, or he was trying to stop me from finding something specific before I could understand what it meant. The distinction was not small. She could see from Tae-hyun's face that he'd already arrived at the same place and was sitting with the discomfort of it. Where is Graham now? She said. We've had limited contact since the night you arrived. He knows you're here. He's been told the operation is proceeding. Tae-hyun's voice was flat and deliberate. I assumed his interest was in protecting his arrangement with me. And now you're not sure what his interest is. Now I'm not sure what his interest has ever been, he said. Quietly, with the particular stillness of a man who didn't like discovering he'd been operating on a flawed assumption for 4 years. Imani stood up. She went to the whiteboard on the far wall she'd claimed it in week 1 and covered it with financial mapping that the staff had learned not to touch, and she uncapped a marker and started writing. Not the financial structure. Names and dates. Graham Pell. 4 years on Tae-hyun's payroll. Introduced the Singapore consultant. Involved in pre-operation structural design. Told Imani to stop the audit. Went quiet after she was brought to the estate. She wrote the dates of the Delaney account movements she'd traced during the original audit. Then she wrote the dates of the Shell Corporation transactions. Then she stopped. She stared at the board. Something was wrong with the sequence. She'd known it was wrong the first time she'd seen it, 3 weeks ago in the rain-soaked records room. And she'd filed it as a construction anomaly, the kind of small timing irregularity that appeared in complex multi-jurisdiction structures because human beings couldn't perfectly synchronize 11 moving parts across 4 time zones. She'd noted it, moved past it, kept pulling the thread that led to Tae-hyun. But now she looked at the dates again, with a different question in mind. The first movement in the Delaney account series, she said. The one that initiated the transfer chain. When exactly did that transaction originate? Tae-hyun came to stand beside her. He looked at the date she'd written. March 14th, 18 months ago. Your operation, she said carefully. When did you authorize it to begin? The actual first movement of funds. He looked at the date, then at her. March 22nd. She turned and looked at him fully. 8 days. The chain had started 8 days before Tae-hyun authorized it to begin. The room was very quiet. Someone initiated the transaction sequence before you did, she said. Tae-hyun's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Operational control didn't slip exactly. It was more that the ground it was standing on shifted, and for 3 full seconds she could see the man underneath the architecture he'd built, around himself, genuinely shaken. That's not possible, he said. Then, immediately, who had access to the initiation keys in March? That's the right question, she said. But I think I already know the answer. Picked up the marker again. Wrote Graham's name at the top of the sequence. Drew a line from Graham to the March 14th transaction. Drew another line from Graham to the Singapore consultant. Drew a third line from Graham to the freight forwarding address that Delaney had just put under surveillance. She stood back. Graham didn't introduce you to the Singapore consultant, she said. Graham used you and the Singapore consultant to build a structure he needed. He moved the money first and let you believe the operation was yours. She looked at the board. And then he told Cormac Delaney's people exactly where to look. Tae-hyun was still. Graham has been skimming from Delaney's accounts, she said. For years, probably. Delaney was getting close to discovering it. So, Graham needed a story. He needed the money to look like it had been moved by someone else, through a structure sophisticated enough to survive a review, with enough legitimate complexity to point investigators away from him and toward an existing conflict. She turned. He used your operation. He used your infrastructure and your motive and your brother's murder to make $40 million in theft from Cormac Delaney look like a calculated financial attack by Kwon Tae-hyun. The silence after she said it was different from other silences in that room. It had mass. He manufactured the war, Tae-hyun said. He manufactured the war, she said, and he's been feeding Delaney information about this estate, because if Delaney destroys your operation, Graham walks away from everything. You take the blame for the $40 million. Delaney's focus is on you. And Graham's theft disappears inside the wreckage of a mafia conflict nobody survives to properly investigate. Tae-hyun crossed to the window. He stood with his back to her and was completely motionless for a long moment, and she understood that she was watching a man absorb the information that 3 years of his life had been built on a manipulation. That his brother's death, not Graham's direct crime, but everything that followed had been weaponized by a man who sat across conference tables and took consulting fees and said, "Trust me on this one," into telephones. When he turned back around, his face was terrifying in its composure. "Where is Graham right now?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "But Tae-hyun, I need to know where he is. Listen to me." She took 2 steps toward him. "If you move against Graham right now, Delaney reads it as confirmation that his intelligence was correct and your operation is collapsing. He'll accelerate. And if Delaney accelerates before midnight, I understand what happens if Delaney accelerates. Then understand that Graham is counting on you to react," she said sharply. "He has been playing you for 3 years. He knows how you think. He knows you'll move against him the moment you have confirmation, and he's positioned himself so that when you do, it looks like exactly what he wants, it to look like an operation in chaos, a syndicate boss who's lost control, $40 million that Kwon Tae-hyun stole from Cormac Delaney and can't protect." Tae-hyun stopped. The rage was there. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the precise way he was controlling his breathing, but underneath it, something colder was working. Something that was actually listening to her. "What do you need?" he said. "Time," she said. 48 hours. And access to every transaction record Graham ever touched going back 5 years. Why 5 years? Because that's how long it takes to build a theft this size without triggering automated flags, she said. He didn't do this in 18 months. He did this over 5 years, and the last 18 months were the exit. I need to find the entry point. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to the desk and picked up his phone and made a call. She heard him give Junho 3 instructions in Korean, precise and without inflection. He set the phone down. "You'll have everything within 2 hours," he said. She nodded and turned back to the whiteboard. What she didn't say what she was keeping behind her teeth for the moment, because the timing wasn't right and she needed him functional and not nuclear, was that her back door was almost certainly going to be needed now. Not as insurance, as the only available weapon. Because if Graham had been feeding Delaney their position, then Delaney already knew the estate's security configuration. Already knew the transfer timeline. Already knew enough to move on them before midnight in 3 days, and when he moved, he wouldn't be interested in conversation. She stared at the whiteboard and kept that calculation private and kept working. The records came in at 9:15. Junho delivered them on a portable drive without comment and left. Imani plugged it in and started pulling Graham's transaction history, going back 60 months as she'd asked, and within the first 40 minutes she found what she was looking for. It wasn't subtle once you knew what you were seeing. The subtlety was in the construction. Graham had been brilliant about construction, using 17 different intermediate accounts across 8 entities to move money in amounts that stayed below automated surveillance thresholds. But the pattern was there, the rhythm of it, the particular way the amounts accelerated in the final 18 months as the exit approached, the way the routing began consolidating. She'd seen similar structures in SEC cases. The specific behavioral fingerprint of someone who'd been patient for years and was beginning to feel the pressure of exposure closing in. Graham hadn't just been skimming. He'd taken $37 million from Delaney's accounts over 5 years. Then he'd routed it through Hanul Pacific's infrastructure, using access codes Tae-hyun had given him as a trusted consultant, and layered it with $3 million more from a secondary source she hadn't identified yet to reach the $40 million. Figure that had appeared in Imani's original audit. The $40 million was never Tae-hyun's weapon. It was Graham's getaway fund. And it was sitting, right now, in a transfer chain that Tae-hyun believed he controlled, scheduled to move at midnight in 3 days, in a way that Graham had designed to permanently implicate Tae-hyun as the architect. She was still processing the secondary source when the first explosion hit. Not a large one. A controlled breach, she'd learn. Later, it was shaped charge on the outer perimeter gate, the kind used by tactical teams rather than the disorganized percussion of a panicked assault. Professional. Measured. The sound reached the working room as a deep concussive thud, followed by the immediate cessation of the ambient hum of the perimeter's electronic monitoring system going offline. The lights in the working room stayed on. Emergency power had kicked in somewhere beneath the floor. She heard running in the corridor. Junho's voice, in Korean, sharp and directional. More running. Tae-hyun was through the working room door in 4 seconds. He came back in 8, with his jacket off and a controlled expression that had moved entirely beyond emotion into operational processing. "Get away from the windows," he said. "There are no windows in this room." "Then stays in this room." He crossed to the desk, opened a drawer she hadn't known existed in the side panel, withdrew a tablet, typed a sequence, and the wall monitor she'd assumed was decorative lit up, with a 12-panel surveillance feed from cameras across the property. She looked at the feeds. Delaney's men were already through the outer perimeter. She could see 8, maybe 10 figures moving through the estate grounds in coordinated pattern. Not panicked, not disorganized. These were people who had rehearsed this approach. "He had the security code," she said. "Yes," Tae-hyun said. Graham gave him the security codes. Yes. He was watching the feeds with absolute focus. Junho has 6 men on the interior perimeter. There's a panic room on the sub-level reinforced independent power, satellite communications. "I need you to go there. I need my laptop. Take it. And the drive Junho brought this morning. Take everything. Go." She pulled the laptop, grabbed the drive, grabbed her notebook. Then she stopped. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Manage what's happening outside," he said, without looking away from the monitor. Tae-hyun. She waited until he looked at her. "Delaney isn't here to talk. Graham has told him you have $40 million of his money, and you're 3 days from destroying his liquidity position. He's here to end this. I know. You're 6 men against however many he brought." Imani. His voice was steady, very steady, the kind of steadiness that comes from having made a decision and being at peace with its weight. "The panic room has satellite uplink capability. You have everything you need to release Delaney's financial records directly to federal investigators. His shipping manifests, the offshore accounts, the payroll records everything you found in the original audit and everything on that drive. She stared at him. If I release that, it exposes your operation too, she said. Yes, he said, Tae-hyun. It also exposes Graham. He held her gaze. It releases the evidence connected to my brother's death. And it removes any legal ambiguity about your role. In this, you become the whistleblower, not the accomplice. And you, she said, where does it leave you? He didn't answer that question. He turned back to the monitor. There's a stairwell behind the bookcase on the north wall of the corridor, he said. Junho will take you down. Don't open the panic room door for anyone except him. You're not answering me. I know. She took 3 steps toward him. Grabbed his arm. Look at me. He turned. There it was again, that unguarded thing she'd seen the night before, but different now. Larger. She'd asked him earlier in the week what happened to her after midnight, and he'd said, I don't want to lose you, as if it cost him something to say it. He was looking at her now like a man who had decided the cost didn't matter anymore. I need you to stay alive, she said. Not for me. For the evidence. For your brother. For the thing you've spent 3 years trying to build toward. If Delaney kills you tonight, Graham wins. Do you understand that? His jaw was working. She could feel the tension in his arm under her hand. Get to the panic room, he said. Tell me you understand. Imani, tell me a long beat. I understand, he said. She released his arm. In the corridor, she could hear Junho moving toward the working room door. On the surveillance monitor, she could see Delaney's men had reached the inner courtyard. 2 of Tae-hyun's guards were moving to intercept. One of Delaney's men had a radio to his mouth. They were 30 seconds from direct contact. She picked up her laptop, looked at Tae-hyun one more time. Don't die being stupid, she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief. I'll do my best. Junho appeared in the doorway. He looked at Imani, then at Tae-hyun, with the expression of a man who had served this operation for a decade, and understood that what he was watching was something none of the contingency plans had accounted for. Ms. Bellrose, he said, we need to move. She followed him into the corridor. Behind her, she heard Tae-hyun's voice, a single phrase in Korean, low and absolute, directed at someone on his phone. Whatever it meant, it had the sound of a man giving an order he had no expectation of reversing. The bookcase opened on a pneumatic hinge. The stairwell behind it was narrow and lit by low emergency strips along the floor. Ho went first. She followed. At the bottom, the panic room was exactly what he'd described: reinforced door, independent power, a bank of monitors showing the same camera feeds she'd seen upstairs, and a satellite communications terminal in the corner that was already running a boot sequence. Junho checked the exterior panel, engaged the locking mechanism, and turned to her. He told me to stay with you, he said. I know, she said. She was already opening the laptop. I need 15 minutes. You have less than that before Delaney's men reach the main structure. Then stop talking to me, she said, and plugged in the drive and started building the transmission that was going to either save all of them or finish what Graham had started. On the monitor above her, she could see Tae-hyun on the main floor of the estate, standing in the entrance hall with 2 of his guards flanking him, watching the courtyard doors. Waiting for Delaney, and Imani 40 feet below him, with her hands moving across a keyboard in the particular focused fury of someone who had decided that tonight was not the night anyone got to win by default, understood with complete clarity that everything she'd spent 3 weeks building toward had just become something larger than any of them had planned for. The transmission wasn't just evidence anymore. It was the only thing standing between Tae-hyun and a man who had come here with no intention of leaving anyone alive to testify about what Graham Pell had done. She typed faster. The satellite terminal took 4 minutes to establish a secure uplink. Imani watched the progress bar and did not watch the clock, and absolutely did not think about what was happening on the floor above her. She focused on the screen. She focused on the transmission architecture she'd been building. For the past 72 hours, in the hidden layer beneath Tae-hyun's operation, the back door he didn't know about, the failsafe she'd constructed, because she'd learned a long time ago that the only insurance worth having was the kind you built yourself. Junho stood at the panic room door with his arms at his sides, and his attention split between the monitor feeds and the reinforced steel at his back. On the feeds, Delaney's men had breached the courtyard doors. Imani had counted 14 of them, coming through the outer perimeter. Tae-hyun had 6 inside. The math was not good, and she refused to do it again, so she kept her eyes on the screen and her hands on the keyboard. "Uplink established," the terminal said, in the flat, effectless voice of automated systems. She started the transfer sequence. The evidence package she'd built contained Delaney's shipping manifests, going back 4 years, the ones she'd pulled from the original audit, cross-referenced with port authority records and freight documentation. It contained his offshore account structure, the payroll records for entities that didn't officially employ anyone, and the financial trail Graham had constructed over 5 years to move $37 million out of Delaney's organization without triggering surveillance flags. Most importantly, it contained the transaction history she'd pulled this morning, Graham's initiation of the transfer chain, 8 days before Tae-hyun authorized his own operation to begin. That single piece of evidence was the hinge on which everything else turned. It was the difference between Tae-hyun as architect and Tae-hyun as victim. It was the difference between Imani as accomplice and Imani as witness. Also included the evidence file Tae-hyun had compiled over 6 months connecting Delaney's organization to the murder in Busan. She hadn't asked his permission. She decided he would understand. The transmission was 40% complete when the first gunshot reached her through the reinforced ceiling. Muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Junho's eyes went to the monitor. On the feed covering the estate's main entrance hall, she could see the confrontation had begun. Tae-hyun stood in the center of the hall with 2 of his men flanking him. Delaney had come through the main doors with 4 of his own. The remaining 10 were split, some moving through the east wing, some contained near the courtyard by Tae-hyun's other guards. Cormac Delaney was a large man, broad through the chest, with the look of someone who'd spent decades being physically intimidating and found it efficient. He was 60, maybe 62. His hair was gray and his face was weathered, and he was wearing an expression that had moved entirely past anger into something more permanent. The monitor had no audio. She watched Delaney's mouth move. She watched Tae-hyun answer. She watched Delaney's right hand come up in a signal, and 2 of his men moved forward. And one of Tae-hyun's guards stepped in front of him. And the hallway became the kind of chaos that surveillance cameras recorded, but couldn't fully explain: bodies moving fast, furniture going over, the particular violent geometry of a space that had just turned into a fight. 58%. She typed faster, compressing the transmission package to accelerate the upload, sacrificing resolution on the documentary attachments because the core financial data was what mattered. The attachments were evidence. The transaction records were proof. "He's holding," Junho said. He was watching the monitor with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen worse and survived it. "Junho's team has the East Wing contained." "That's you," Imani said. "You're talking about yourself in third person." "Force of habit when I'm stressed," he said, without any change in expression. She almost laughed. The inappropriateness of it under the circumstances was the only thing that made it possible. 71%. On the monitor, the hallway had partially cleared. 2 of Delaney's men were down, not dead, she thought, but not functional. One of Tae-hyun's guards was against the wall, with his hand pressed to his side. Tae-hyun himself was still standing, which she registered with a relief so immediate and physical, it surprised her. Delaney had pulled back to the center of the room. He had a phone in his hand. He was making a call. "Who is he calling?" she said. Junho watched the monitor, routing more men from the perimeter, probably. He came with enough to handle what he expected. His jaw worked. He didn't expect Tae-hyun to be this calm about it. Why is that unexpected? Because Delaney's been told the operation is compromised. Graham told him Tae-hyun is losing control of the financial structure. He glanced at her. A man losing control doesn't stand in his own entrance hall and negotiate. "He's not negotiating," Imani said. "He's stalling." She looked at the transmission progress. 83%. Then the monitor showing the east wing flickered and went dark. Junho moved to the panel, hit a reset sequence. The feed came back for 2 seconds, grainy and jumping, and she saw enough to understand that someone had found the secondary camera junction and physically disabled it. That required knowing where the junction was. That required interior knowledge of the estate's security infrastructure. Graham had given them a map. "We need to move," Junho said. "I need 4 more minutes." Ms. Bellrose. 4 minutes, she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. 4 minutes, and Delaney's entire financial operation is sitting in a federal server in Washington, and every law enforcement resource in the Pacific Northwest has a reason to be at this address. 4 minutes is worth whatever happens in 4 minutes. Junho looked at her for a long moment. 3, he said. "I can give you 3. He moved to the secondary equipment locker on the far wall, opened it, and removed 2 items that Imani registered in her peripheral vision and chose not to fully examine because what she didn't look at directly, she couldn't be made to testify about later. 89%. Above her, through the ceiling, she heard something heavy hit the floor. Then voices raised, overlapping, then silence, which was somehow worse. She looked at the monitor. The entrance hall feed was still live. Tae-hyun was no longer in the center of the room. Delaney was moving toward the interior corridor, 2 men behind him, and his expression had changed from the permanent fury she'd seen earlier to something more focused, more directed. He was moving toward the interior of the estate, moving toward the stairwell. "He knows where we are," she said. "Yes," Junho said. He was at the door. Graham told him about the panic room. 94%. She looked at the progress bar, and then at the door, and then back at the progress bar, and made the calculation that she'd been trained her entire professional life to make under pressure, not the emotional calculation. Not the one that factored in what she wanted, but the cold operational one that factored in what was true. 94% was enough if the package compressed correctly. The core transaction data was fully uploaded. What remained was supplementary documentation important, but not the hinge. She hit transmit on the partial package. Then she opened a secondary window and kept uploading the remainder, while the primary package went through. The terminal displayed, transmission in progress, Federal Financial Crimes Division received. She exhaled. "Okay," she said, "we can move." Junho was already at the door. He disengaged the lock, pushed the door open 3 inches, listened, pushed it the rest of the way. The stairwell was empty. The emergency lighting was still running. From somewhere above 2 floors, maybe 3, she could hear movement. Heavy, deliberate, organized. Delaney's people. Junho went up the stairs first. She followed, laptop under her arm, the drive in her jacket pocket, her free hand on the wall to keep herself oriented in the narrow red-lit space. Her breathing was controlled by effort. Her pulse was not. They came out through the bookcase on the ground floor corridor. Corridor was empty. The working room door was open. She could see her whiteboard from the doorway. Graham's name still written at the top of the sequence, the lines connecting him to everything. Junho held up a fist. She stopped. From the entrance hall, she heard Tae-hyun's voice. She couldn't make out words. Then Delaney's voice, heavier and slower, with the deliberate rhythm of a man making a point he expects to be remembered. Then she heard Tae-hyun say, "Clearly and without elevation, Graham built your financial structure the same way he built mine. Everything you've been told about the 40 million is a lie he constructed to protect himself. Your accountant figured it out, and you had her killed." Silence. Then Delaney said, "What accountant?" And Tae-hyun said, "Exactly." Junho moved. She moved with him, staying low, staying close to the wall, moving toward the entrance hall from the side corridor that led out near the base of the main staircase. She could see the hall from this angle without being in it, Tae-hyun in the center, Delaney 6 feet from him, 2 of Delaney's men in peripheral positions. One of Tae-hyun's guards was on the floor, not moving. She locked that information away and dealt with it later. Tae-hyun was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. He was standing with his weight distributed slightly forward, the way someone stands when they're managing pain they're not going to acknowledge. and he was looking at Delaney with the complete steadiness of a man who had decided what the next 10 minutes of his life were going to cost and made his peace with the price. Delaney was looking at him with something new working behind the fury. Not belief exactly, but something that was listening. Graham introduced me to my financial consultant 3 years ago, Tae-hyun said. His voice was conversational, almost. He said the man was clean, experienced, and loyal. The man was yours. Delaney went very still. Your consultant, Tae-hyun continued, has been moving money from your accounts for 5 years. Graham has been managing the routing. The 40 million you believe I stole from you, it was never mine. Graham moved it through my infrastructure without my authorization, using access codes I gave him as a trusted contractor. The transaction chain that pointed to my operation was built by Graham to point to me. The silence in the hall was extreme. Imani, in the side corridor, was watching Delaney's face on the monitor of Junho's secondary tablet. Junho had pulled it from his jacket and angled it so she could see the feed without being in the room. Delaney's expression had moved through several stages in the past 30 seconds. She watched it arrive somewhere she hadn't expected, not rage. Something colder and more calculating. You have evidence of this, Delaney said. My forensic accountant rebuilt the transaction history from the source data, Tae-hyun said. The original initiation codes for the transfer chain have Graham's authorization stamp. 8 days before I authorized my own operation to begin, the chain was already running. Delaney looked at his men, then back at Tae-hyun. Where is the accountant? He said. Somewhere safe, Tae-hyun said. Delaney took a step forward. Tae-hyun didn't move. I have 12 men in this building, Delaney said. 11, Tae-hyun said. The one you sent to the East Wing found Junho's secondary team. Delaney stopped. I'm not your enemy, Tae-hyun said. Graham is your enemy. Graham has been your enemy for 5 years, and you've been paying him a consulting fee while he did it. His jaw was tight. The blood from the cut above his eye was tracking down the side of his face, and he wasn't touching it. Your operation is finished regardless of what you do in this room tonight. The evidence is already with federal investigators. Your financial records, your shipping manifests, your offshore structure gone. He paused. But Graham is still out there, and if you let him get out of the country, he takes 37 million of your money with him. The longest silence of the night. Imani's hand was pressed flat against the corridor wall. She could feel the plaster vibrating faintly, the estate's ventilation system, the residual hum of the emerging power, the physical reality of a building that had been through a violent hour and was holding together through its own construction. She became aware that Junho was looking at her. She looked back at him. He gave her a small, precise nod toward the entrance hall. Question. She shook her head. Tae-hyun had the room. She was not going to walk into it and change what he was managing by making her presence something Delaney could use. Then her phone, the one Junho had returned to her 2 days ago, when Tae-hyun had quietly stopped pretending the communication restrictions were still necessary, buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Seattle area code. She answered, keeping her voice below the level that would carry to the hall. Imani, Graham's voice, smooth and familiar and completely wrong, like a song in a language she'd just learned to distrust. I know where you are. I need you to listen to me very carefully. He said nothing. I know you've built something in the system, he continued. I know because I built the same type of backdoor 18 months ago, and I recognize the signature. Whatever you think you've transmitted, it's incomplete, without the primary authorization key. The federal server received your package, but they can't authenticate it without assigning code that currently sits on a device I'm holding. He paused. I'm willing to give you the code, in exchange for one thing. What? She said. Tell me where Delaney is in the building, he said. Specifically, she closed her eyes for 1 second. Open them. You tipped Delaney to attack this estate, she said. And now you're trying to use the attack to kill him. I'm solving a problem, Graham said. Delaney was going to discover the money eventually. This was always the cleanest resolution. Tae-hyun and Delaney eliminate each other. The evidence points to a syndicate conflict, and I'm 300 miles away with clean hands. Except I built the back door, she said. Except you built the back door, he agreed. Which changes the math slightly. The authentication key, Imani. Tell me where Delaney is and you get the code. The federal case becomes airtight, your name is fully cleared, and you walk out of that building tonight. She looked at the tablet in Junho's hand. Entrance, hall feed. Tae-hyun still standing. Delaney still listening. And if I don't tell you, she said, then the package you transmitted is inadmissible. Sophisticated forgery defense. Missing authentication. Chain of custody issues. I've had 3 years to think about this contingency, Imani. I have lawyers already briefed. He paused. You spent 3 weeks in that building. Without proper authentication, the question of what you did there becomes very complicated. She was quiet for a moment. Give me the code first, she said. He laughed. Not unkindly. You know I won't do that. Then we have a problem, she said, because I'm not going to tell you where he is. Imani, you used me, she said. You used my credentials and my professional record and 3 weeks of my life and a man's grief about his dead brother to cover a theft. And then you tried to get me killed. Her voice was very steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. I'm not going to help you finish what you started. Not for the code, not for anything. The silence on the line was different from Delaney's silences. It was the silence of a man recalculating. The package is already enough, she said. I know that because I built it, and I know what's in it, and I know how federal financial crimes cases work. You're betting that I don't know my own work well enough to call your bluff. She paused. You always underestimated me, Graham. That was your mistake from the beginning. She ended the call. Junho was looking at her. She showed him the screen unknown number, call duration 47 seconds, and he looked at it, and his expression did something complicated. Authentication key, he said. He's bluffing, she said. Probably. She paused. 70%. Those are not reassuring odds. No, she said. They're not. From the entrance hall, Delaney's voice again. Where is Graham Pell right now? Tae-hyun, I don't know. He went dark when the attack began. Delaney turned to one of his men and said something inaudible. The man raised his phone and made a call. Imani looked at Junho. He looked at her. They were both thinking the same thing, and neither of them said it because saying it out loud would make it the next thing that needed to be managed, and they already had enough things to manage. Graham had tipped Delaney to the attack. Graham had given Delaney the security codes and the floor plan. Graham had been maneuvering both men toward this building all evening. And if Delaney's man reached Graham on that phone, the entrance hall monitor showed Delaney's man lower the phone. Say something to Delaney. Delaney's expression changed. He turned back to Tae-hyun. Graham is on the property, Delaney said. Calm in his voice was absolute and very dangerous. Came with my men. I didn't know. The room shifted. Tae-hyun's face changed. She saw it even through the grainy monitor feed, the microsecond of recalibration as the information landed. Graham was in the building. Graham had come here himself, using Delaney's assault as cover, intending to be inside the building, when it concluded close enough to manage the aftermath, close enough to ensure that neither Tae-hyun nor the evidence survived the night. Imani stepped into the entrance hall. She didn't decide to do it. Her body made the decision slightly before her mind caught up, the same way it had made the decision in the parking garage 3 weeks ago, not courage exactly, but the particular refusal to let the situation be managed by anyone other than herself. Every head in the room turned. Delaney looked at her. He was seeing a black woman in her early 30s, with a laptop under her arm and a bruise on her jaw from where she'd caught the doorframe coming through the bookcase, and she could see him processing what he was looking at versus what he'd been told to expect. You're the accountant, he said. I'm the forensic accountant, she said. And Graham Pell is somewhere in this building right now, trying to make sure none of us are alive when the federal response teams arrive. She looked at Delaney steadily. We have approximately 20 minutes before they do. After that, it doesn't matter where Graham is, because there are enough law enforcement assets converging on this address that he can't get out regardless. Delaney looked at her for a long moment. Unless he's already out, he said. He's not, she said. He came here to watch. Men like Graham always come to watch. They need to see the thing they built actually work. She held the laptop up slightly. But the evidence I transmitted included his initiation codes, his authorization stamps, his routing signatures going back 5 years. If he walks out of this building tonight, he walks into the rest of his life with federal investigators on every account he touches. She paused. He's not leaving. He came here expecting to be the last man standing. He's trying to find a way to still make that true. Delaney looked at Tae-hyun. Tae-hyun looked back at him. Something passed between them, not alliance exactly, and not trust. Because men like them didn't get to trust each other, and both of them knew it, but a shared recognition of the specific enemy. They were both standing inside a problem that Graham had built for them. East Wing, Tae-hyun said. The camera junction he disabled is near the secondary server room. He'd want access to the network infrastructure. Delaney turned to his remaining men. Gave 2 short instructions. Jun-ho appeared in the hallway entrance, assessed the room in one sweep, and moved to Tae-hyun's side without comment. Tae-hyun looked at the blood on his own hand from where he'd pressed it to his side at some point during the confrontation, and Jun-ho looked at it and said something in Korean that made Tae-hyun shake his head once. Dismissively, in the way people dismiss injuries that are real but inconveniently timed. Server room, Jun-ho said to Imani. It has an independent network connection. If Graham is trying to intercept the transmission or introduce a counterfiling, he can't intercept what's already been received, Imani said. But he could introduce contaminated data, forged timestamps. If he gets access to the network trunk and can inject a falsified version of the authorization chain. She was already moving. She didn't wait for anyone to tell her it was safe. The East Wing corridor was lit by emergency strips, one panel flickering and dying as she passed it, and she could hear 2 things simultaneously, footsteps above her, on the 2nd floor, purposeful and fast. And somewhere to her left the sound of a door being forced. Server room, 2nd door on the left. She hit it at a run and it was unlocked. Graham had already been through, and the room inside was small and cold and smelled of recycled air and warm electronics. And Graham Pell was standing at the network trunk with a device in his hand and his back to her. He turned when she came through the door. He looked exactly as she remembered him, mid-50s, unremarkably built, with the pleasant professional face he'd worn through 4 years of editorial meetings and audit reviews and phone calls where he told her to trust him. He was breathing harder than normal. His jacket was gone. He looked at her with the expression of a man running a rapid reassessment. Imani, he said, you need to let me finish this. Step away from the trunk, she said. The device I'm connecting will authenticate the package you transmitted. Step away from the trunk, Graham. I'm not your enemy, he said. I was never your enemy. You were collateral in a financial operation that had nothing to do with you personally. You forged my credentials, she said. You used my professional authorization to move stolen money through a criminal infrastructure, and then you sent me to do the audit yourself, knowing what I'd find. Because you needed someone credible to discover the discrepancy, and you needed that someone to be me, so that, if anything collapsed, I was the name on the paperwork. He was quiet. You used me as your exit strategy, she said, while paying me a salary and telling me I was good at my job. You are good at your job, he said. It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. I know, she said. That's why I built the back door. She held up the laptop, turned it so he could see the screen. The transmission confirmation. Federal Financial Crimes Division. Timestamp. Received and logged. His face changed. The authentication key you told me you were holding, she said. Let me see it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the device down on the server housing. She crossed the room and picked it up, looked at it. It was a standard hardware token, the kind used for 2-factor authentication on high-security financial systems. She looked at the serial number on the back. It was registered to a system that had been decommissioned 8 months ago. She looked at him. You were bluffing, she said. Graham sat down on the server room floor with the slow, controlled collapse of a man whose legs have decided before the rest of him. I was bluffing, he said. Footsteps in the corridor. Heavy and fast. Tae-hyun came through the door first, Jun-ho behind him. And then two of Delaney's men who stopped in the doorway and looked at Graham sitting on the floor and the laptop in Imani's hand, and the specific atmosphere of a room where something had just finished. Tae-hyun looked at Graham. Graham looked back at him. The silence between them had 18 months of constructed betrayal in it, and the murder of a 27-year-old musician in a parking structure in Busan, and 4 years of consulting fees and access codes and introductions to financial architects who turned out to be instruments of someone else's theft. Tae-hyun crouched down in front of Graham. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "My brother's name," he said, was Kwon Tae-hyun. He played traditional instruments. He had a performance scheduled in Seoul 3 weeks after he died. He held Graham's eyes. "Say his name." Graham's face worked. "Kwon Tae-hyun," he said. Came out barely above a whisper. Tae-hyun held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he stood, turned to Delaney's men in the doorway. "He doesn't leave this room until federal response arrives," he said. One of Delaney's men nodded. Tae-hyun turned, looked at Imani. She was still holding the laptop. The transmission confirmation was still on the screen. From somewhere outside the estate, distant but growing, the particular layered sound of multiple vehicles converging on a single point, she could hear the first sirens. Tae-hyun looked at her with a face that had shed everything except what was true. "The transmission went through," she said. "Yes," he said. "All of it," she said, "including the evidence about Busan." Something moved through him. Not relief, the wrong word. Something older and more complete than relief. Something that had been waiting for a long time to land somewhere solid. "We have maybe 10 minutes, Junho said from the doorway. He was watching the corridor, his attention already shifting to the next problem. Tae-hyun didn't move. He was looking at Imani. "There's a route out of the estate," he said. "Underground access. I had it built when the estate was constructed." He paused. "You should use it. And you," she said. He was quiet. "Tae-hyun, I told you months ago that I built this operation on a lie someone else constructed," he said. "That's not entirely exculpatory. My hands weren't clean before Graham." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise to avoid what's coming through that gate." The sirens were closer. She looked at him for a long moment. "Then neither am I," she said. He started to say something. "I'm a witness," she said before he could. "A forensic accountant who was taken from a parking garage and spent 3 weeks inside a criminal organization's estate discovering evidence that broke open a 5-year theft and a manufactured syndicate war." She held his eyes. "That's the story that's true. That's the story I'm going to tell. And I'm going to tell it standing right here." Junho turned from the corridor, looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had served this operation for 10 years and was watching it end in a way none of the planning had accounted for, and wasn't entirely sure what that meant for him personally. "Junho," Tae-hyun said, without looking away from Imani. "Yes, call the legal team. Tell them to meet at the federal processing facility." He paused. "Tell them to bring 2 sets of representation." Junho looked at him for a moment. "2, he said. "1 for me," Tae-hyun said. "1 for Miss Bellrose." Junho made the call. Outside, the first tactical vehicle reached the outer gate, and the night went from sirens to lights, the red and blue cycling through the state's windows, and turning the server room into something that felt briefly, strangely, like a heartbeat. Delaney was in the entrance hall, with his hands visible when the federal response teams came through the gate. Graham was still on the server room floor, and Imani was standing in the East Wing corridor with her laptop under her arm and her back straight, and her eyes clear, and Tae-hyun was beside her, with a cut above his eye that had stopped bleeding somewhere in the last hour, and a stillness about him that was different from the operational stillness she'd catalogued in the first days, not the stillness of a man managing a situation, but the stillness of a man who had stopped managing and simply stood. The first federal agents came through the interior door. Imani stepped forward to meet them. She had been the one who found the 40 million. She had been the one who built the back door. She had been the one who refused to run when every rational calculation said to run. And she had done it not because she was fearless, but because she had learned. Over 3 weeks inside a waterfront estate that had started as a prison and turned into something she didn't have a clean word for yet. that the most dangerous thing a person could do was hand the end of their own story to someone else and hope it came out right. "My name is Imani Bellrose," she said. "I'm a forensic accountant. I have a transmission confirmation from your Financial Crimes Division and approximately 90 minutes of documented evidence to walk you through." She looked at the agent directly. "You're going to want to start with a man named Graham Pell." Behind her, she heard Tae-hyun take a slow, careful breath and hold it, and wait for whatever came next with the particular patience of a man who had finally run out of plans and was learning, for the first time in his life, what it meant to simply stand in the truth of what he'd done and let it be enough. The sound like green wood splitting. The federal agents came in fast, and they came in organized, and they came in with the particular controlled energy of people who had been waiting on authorization for longer than they were comfortable with and were not going to let anything go sideways now that they finally had it. Imani counted the first wave, without meaning to 6, through the interior door, 3 covering the east wing entrance, more voices and radio traffic from the outer perimeter, where additional units were locking down the grounds. She stood in the corridor with her hands visible and her laptop under her arm, and her breathing deliberate, and she walked the lead agent through the essentials in under 5 minutes, because 5 minutes was what she had. And she knew how to compress information under pressure. Who she was, how she'd come to be inside the building, what she'd transmitted and at what time, where Graham Pell was currently seated on a server room floor with 2 men standing over him, where Cormac Delaney was, where Tae-hyun was. The lead agent, late 40s, gray at the temples, the face of a man who processed unusual situations by making them procedurally usual, listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her with a slightly recalibrated quality of attention. "You transmitted from inside the estate," he said. "Panic room sublevel, satellite uplink. Your Financial Crimes Division confirmed receipt at 11:47. "We did," he said. "Miss Bellrose, I need you to understand that we're going to require a complete accounting of everything that occurred here." "I have notes," she said. She held up the notebook. He looked at it. She could see him processing what the notebook represented, not just documentation, but the specific discipline of a person who had maintained a record under conditions that made record-keeping difficult and sometimes dangerous. "All right," he said. He turned to one of the agents behind him. "Get her somewhere quiet." They took her to a sitting room off the main corridor, and 2 agents sat across from her for the next 2 hours, and she told them everything without editing it. She'd made that decision sometime in the past 3 weeks, that she was not going to construct a curated version of events, not for investigators, not for herself. The curated version was what people built when they were protecting something, and she was done protecting anything except the truth of what had happened. She told about the audit, and Graham's phone call, and the parking garage, and the 3 weeks inside the estate. She told them about the financial architecture and the authorization chain, and what her name had originally been positioned to mean in that chain. Told them that Tae-hyun had rebuilt the authorization structure to remove her from legal exposure. She told them about the back door she'd built without his knowledge. She told them about the server room and Graham's bluff with the decommissioned hardware token. A sound like green wood splitting, the watching agent younger than the lead, with the attentive stillness of someone who was still learning how to look at her when she finished and said, "You're describing a man who took you from a parking garage and then voluntarily exposed himself to protect you." "Both things are true," she said. "I'm asking you to put both in the record." He nodded. "Both will be in the record." Down the hall, through 2 closed doors, she could hear the murmur of another interview being conducted. She knew it was Tae-hyun's voice from the particular rhythm. Of it, not the words, just the cadence. She'd spent enough hours in rooms with that voice to recognize it through walls. She noticed she could identify it through walls, and she set that information aside because she had enough to deal with right now. In another part of the estate, Graham Pell was being formally processed. She heard his voice once raised, not panicked, but performing the particular kind of controlled indignation that people deploy when they're running the math on diminishing options. She recognized it because she'd heard it before in boardrooms and audit reviews. The voice Graham used when he was trying to manage a situation that had moved beyond his management. It didn't sound like it was working. It wasn't. The interview with the federal agents took 2 hours and 14 minutes. When it ended, Imani sat in the sitting room alone for a while. The estate was still active around her, agents moving through corridors, radio traffic, the procedural machinery of a significant arrest operation grinding through its necessary stages. Outside, through the window of the sitting room, she could see the red and blue of the vehicle lights cycling across the perimeter wall, steady and patient. She looked at her hands in her lap. They were steady. She was faintly surprised by this, and then faintly unsurprised, because she'd noticed over the past 3 weeks that she tended toward stillness under the kind of pressure that produced stillness rather than shaking in her. It wasn't courage. It was more like the particular response of a person whose nervous system was not that external chaos was not sufficient reason to add internal chaos on top of it. She thought about calling her sister. She thought about what she would say and realized she had no idea where to begin, which meant the call needed to wait until she'd had enough sleep to assemble something coherent. She thought about Tae-hyun. She stopped herself from doing that too extensively, because the situation didn't currently benefit from it, and she had always been good at tabling things until they could be addressed properly. An agent appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Bellrose, we're ready to transport you to the field office for continuation of your statement. There's a vehicle waiting." She stood, picked up her laptop, looked around the sitting room, the ordinary furniture of a waterfront estate that she'd never been in before tonight, but that felt, strangely, like a room she recognized. She followed the agent out. She did not look toward the corridor where Tae-hyun's interview was still happening. She'd made a specific decision about that she was going to handle the next several hours on her own terms, with her own clarity, a sound like green wood splitting, without letting the complicated weight of whatever was between them influence the account she gave of what had happened. The truth didn't need that weight on it. The truth was better without it. She got into the federal vehicle. The drive took 31 minutes. She gave her continuation statement over the following 4 hours, then a supplementary statement, then answered a specific set of questions about the technical architecture of the transmission she'd built. The financial crimes specialist who joined the interview at 2 in the morning was thorough and clearly competent. And they spent 90 minutes going through the package she'd sent, verification layer by verification layer. When they were done, the specialist leaned back in her chair and said, "This is complete. This is thorough. How long were you working on this?" "The transmission structure." 3 days, Imani said. "The underlying evidentiary package took the full 3 weeks. While you were being held in the estate." "While I was working in the estate," Imani said. "The distinction matters." The specialist looked at her for a moment. "It does," she said. "It'll be in the record." They released her at 4:45 in the morning with a temporary contact order. She was to make herself available for follow-up interviews. She was not to leave the state without notification. She was to preserve all documentation she'd referenced in her statements. She agreed to all of it. A federal transport vehicle drove her home. She stood in her apartment at 5:15, with the lights off and the city doing its pre-dawn thing outside the window, the particular quiet of Seattle in the hours before the waterfront woke up, when the only sounds were weather and water and the distant, mechanical breath of a city between one day and the next. She didn't turn the lights on for a while. She stood in the dark kitchen and drank a glass of water and let the past 3 weeks move through her, the way you let something move through you when you've been holding it at arm's length for a long time and finally have the space to let it come close. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't supposed to be. It was just the honest reckoning with what had happened, the parking garage, the estate, the 3 weeks, the financial architecture, the kiss in the working room. A sound like green wood splitting, the server room ram on the floor, and Tae-hyun, bleeding in the entrance hall, and the sound of the sirens coming through the estate's walls like a clock that had finally reached the hour it had been counting toward. She pressed her palm flat against the kitchen counter, felt the cold of the surface. Then she went to bed. She slept for 12 hours without moving. The formal clearance of Imani Bellrose from all criminal and professional liability took 61 days. The investigation moved with the kind of institutional thoroughness that federal financial crimes cases required, not fast, but inexorable, the way a very large and very precise machine moves when it has been given the right coordinates. The transaction records she'd transmitted were authenticated within the first week. Graham's digital signature on the initiation codes, the ones dated 8 days before Tae-hyun had authorized his own operation to begin, was confirmed by 3 separate forensic analysis teams. His 5-year transaction history, the 17 intermediate accounts, the $37 million, moving in carefully calibrated increments below automated surveillance threshold. All of it assembled into a federal case file that prosecutors would later describe as among the most comprehensively documented financial crime packages they had received. Imani's professional license was provisionally suspended during the investigation period, as required by procedure. She understood the requirement and didn't fight it. She used the time to do something she'd been putting off for green for years. She drafted the business plan for an independent forensic investigation practice. Just her name on the door. Nobody else's money. Nobody else's institutional framework. Nobody else's politics about what the numbers were allowed to say. On day 61, the suspension was lifted. The formal findings described her as a material witness who had been coerced into proximity with criminal operations and had acted throughout to preserve evidence and prevent harm. The unauthorized transmission of financial records to federal investigators was characterized as a decisive factor in the successful prosecution of 3 separate criminal enterprises. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network issued a letter of commendation that she read once, placed in a folder, and didn't look at again for 7 months. Because the way institutional praise sat on top of something she'd done, primarily to stay alive, felt slightly beside the point. She filed her business incorporation papers. The same afternoon, the clearance came through. Graham Pell's trial ran for 9 weeks. The defense team was sophisticated and expensive and tried 3 different strategic angles: the forgery defense that Graham had threatened her with in the server room, coercion argument suggesting he'd been operating under duress from Tae-hyun's organization, and a technical challenge to the chain of custody on the digital evidence. None of it landed. The forgery defense collapsed on contact with the forensic authentication. 3 independent analyses, 2 of which the defense team had requested themselves, and then declined to introduce when the results came back. The coercion argument required establishing a relationship with Tae-hyun's organization that the evidence contradicted at every point, including the initiation codes dated 8 days before Tae-hyun's operation began. The chain of custody challenge was addressed by Imani's own testimony, which she delivered over 2 days in federal court, with the specific composed precision of someone who had built the evidentiary package herself and could explain every decision in it. Graham's attorney cross-examined her for 4 hours. She didn't give him anything useful. Afterward, in the courthouse corridor, the federal prosecutor, a woman in her 50s, who moved through institutional spaces with the efficiency of long practice, stopped beside her and said, "You were good in there." "I know the material," Imani said. The prosecutor looked at her for a moment. "That's not what made you good," she said, and walked on. Graham was convicted on 11 counts, sentenced to 22 years. He would be 78 years old when eligibility for release became a conversation, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether the consequences had matched the construction. Imani was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She was in Tacoma, conducting the preliminary review on her first official case as an independent forensic investigator, a pension fund audit for a manufacturing company with some unexplained gaps in its contribution timeline. It was completely unglamorous and required exactly the kind of focused, patient attention to numerical truth that she'd spent her entire career building, and she loved it in the specific, uncomplicated way. She loved work that asked everything of her and promised nothing except the work itself. Cormac Delaney's case moved more slowly and then resolved more completely. His organization had been more structurally dependent on the financial architecture Graham had corrupted than anyone had understood during the operation, the offshore account system that federal investigators froze within 6 hours of receiving. Imani's transmission had been carrying liquidity for operations across 3 states. Without it, the cash flow problems began immediately and cascaded. Within 30 days, 2 of his senior operational managers had engaged their own defense attorneys and begun preliminary cooperation discussions. Within 90 days, the cooperation discussions had become formal agreements. Delaney held out longer than his organization. He was that kind of man, someone who'd built something from the ground up and couldn't quite believe it was actually ending. A sound like green wood splitting, couldn't process the information that the foundation had been undermined by someone he'd trusted and paid and never thought to watch. He tried 3 defense angles of his own over 14 months. The evidence was too complete. The cooperation from his own people too extensive. He took a plea in the end. 26 years for racketeering, conspiracy, and financial crimes. His legal team negotiated the terms. He provided information about several specific incidents in exchange for sentencing consideration on subsidiary charges. A sound like green he provided, and among the information he provided was the order that had been given regarding a parking structure in Busan, South Korea, and the men who had been dispatched to carry it out. The South Korean authorities had been building their own case for months by then. Working from the evidence package, Imani had transmitted and supplementary materials that Tae-hyun's cooperation with federal investigators had produced. The Busan case had enough to proceed without Delaney's contribution. His account simply made the timeline cleaner and removed the last plausible deniability argument from the men who had been charged. The trial in Seoul took 6 weeks. Imani followed it through news feeds and through Junho, who sent her brief factual updates at intervals not detailed, just enough. He had a particular talent for knowing exactly how much information was useful without crossing into what was none of his business, which she had come to appreciate. 3 convictions. Kwon Tae-hyun, who had been 27 years old and had a performance scheduled in Seoul 3 weeks after the night in the parking structure, finally had something the law could put a name and a sentence to. It wasn't resurrection. It wasn't repair. SIPs. It was the specific, finite thing that accountability could offer when nothing else was available. And Imani sat with the news for a long time and thought about what it meant that justice came in this form documented. Procedural, incomplete, and still somehow necessary. Tae-hyun's cooperation with federal investigators had begun before his formal arrest processing was complete. His attorney had made the initial contact while they were still at the estate. And by the time Tae-hyun arrived at the federal field office, the framework of what he was prepared to offer had already been outlined. Not because he'd been strategic about it in the way he was strategic about most things, not because he'd calculated the cooperation as the best available option and pursued it accordingly. A sound like because he'd made a decision somewhere in the entrance hall of his estate, standing in front of Cormac Delaney, with his eye cut and his side aching, and the sound of sirens coming through the walls, that he was done building his life on the logic of could be controlled and protected and kept away from consequences. He was done with that architecture. What he provided was comprehensive. Not summary information, the full operational map of his syndicate going back 8 years. Personnel, contacts, political relationships, the specific mechanisms by which waterfront influence had been cultivated and maintained across 3 port authorities. He provided the names of people he'd worked with, people who had worked for him, people who had been on the periphery and benefited from it. He provided financial records that his investigators hadn't known existed. The cooperation agreement took 3 months to finalize. The legal process that followed took considerably longer. But the agreement had an endpoint, not a short one, but an endpoint, and Tae-hyun had accepted it without negotiating, for more than what was accurate, which his attorney had advised against, and which Tae-hyun had done anyway. His legit companies were separated from the syndicate assets by court order during the investigation period and placed under independent management. The estate, the waterfront property with the perimeter wall and the panic room sublevel and the surveillance monitor that Imani had stared at while typing faster than she'd ever typed in her life was seized. A sound like green wood splitting, the criminal infrastructure he'd spent a decade constructing was dismantled with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that had been applied to Delaney's organization. What remained after the dismantling was a man who was genuinely starting over, which was different from the various fresh starts he'd engineered at different points in his life. Those had always been structural new entities, new jurisdictions, new arrangements that preserved the underlying logic of the empire while adjusting its surface. This was not structural. This was the actual thing. He served his time. He did not make it dramatic. He kept his head down and he read extensively. And he spent a significant portion of the period thinking, with more patience than he'd previously brought to the activity, about the specific question of who he was when the architecture was gone. Jun-ho, who had his own legal proceedings to navigate his cooperation with federal investigators during the estate operation, had been weighed carefully against his decade of service to Tae-hyun's organization, emerged from his own process with a suspended sentence and a set of requirements that regular check-ins and strict prohibitions on certain professional activities. He found work in private security consulting, legitimate work, the kind that required his particular skill set without requiring him to stand in corridors listening for the sound of approaching operational problems. He stayed in contact with both of them throughout. Imani, because he'd developed something in the 3 weeks at the estate that he would never characterize as friendship, but functioned like it. Tae-hyun, because that was a different kind of loyalty, older, less explicable, not contingent on circumstances. A sound ditwit between them during the period when direct communication was legally complicated, and he performed this function with the same precise economy he brought to everything, providing exactly the information that was useful and none that wasn't. 14 months after the night at the estate, he sent Tae-hyun a message that said, "Her practice has 3 federal referrals." She hired someone. Tae-hyun read it twice. He sent back, "Is she sleeping enough?" Jun-ho replied, "She's fine. She bought a house." Tae-hyun didn't respond to that. Set the phone down and looked at the ceiling of the room he was currently occupying and thought about a forensic accountant who had bought a house with a water view and hired a junior associate and was building something with her name on it. A sound seemed Keaton, and the particular complicated feeling this produced in him was something he'd had enough time to examine thoroughly enough to know what it was. He sent Jun-ho a message. 8 days later, "Tell her the practice is going well." "Don't tell her I asked about sleep." Jun-ho replied, "Already done." She said she knew. Of course, she did. The morning Tae-hyun walked out of the federal detention facility. It was a Tuesday in November with fog sitting on everything and the temperature low enough to see your breath. He had a jacket, a bag with the items he'd been permitted to keep during the process, and a meeting with a logistics consulting firm scheduled for Thursday that he'd arranged through correspondence over the past several months. He had a rental apartment, secured through his attorney's office. He had enough money in a legitimate account carefully documented, fully disclosed during the cooperation process to sustain himself while the consulting practice found its footing. He did not have bodyguards. He did not have a car. He stood outside the federal facility for a moment in the November cold and looked at the street. A city bus stop was visible 40 meters to his left. He walked to it. He waited 6 minutes. He got on the bus and sat in a window seat and watched Seattle move past the glass on a Tuesday morning, the ordinary life of a city going about its ordinary business. People with coffee cups and bags and phones, and the particular focused inwardness of people who are thinking about something other than where they are. He watched it and thought, this is real. This is the actual texture of a life. Not managed, not armored, just this. He got off 3 stops from the waterfront and walked the rest of the way. He found himself on a pier without quite having planned it. The waterfront had been pulling at him since before the bus ride, some combination of professional instinct and personal geography, the specific gravity of a place you've oriented your life toward for a long time. He sat on a bench. He looked at the water. He let the fog do what fog does, and he sat in it and was, for the first time in a very long time, simply in a place without needing the place to be anything other than what it was. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there when he became aware that someone was approaching from his left. He knew before he turned. Old habits. Imani was walking along the pier in a dark jacket with her hands in her pockets and her face arranged in the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she hadn't yet decided how to approach. He'd catalogued that expression in the first week at the estate and spent the subsequent period more familiar with its variations than he'd intended to. She stopped a few feet from the bench. He stood. They looked at each other. "You take the bus," she said. "Jun-ho," he said. "Jun-ho is terrible at keeping things to himself," she said. Jun-ho keeps exactly the things to himself that he decides to keep. he said. Everything else he considers fair distribution. She almost smiled. Smain.
He could see it working at the corner of her mouth, the same expression he'd cataloged too, the one that arrived when something hit its mark and she was deciding whether to give it the full acknowledgement or hold it back.
She gave it half. He stood on the pier and looked at her, and didn't say any of the 17 things he'd prepared. They'd all felt right in the construction and wrong in this moment, which was the thing about prepared statements. They belonged to the person you were when you prepared them, not the person standing in front of the actual moment. I don't know how to do this, he said instead. She looked at him. I spent considerable time, he said, thinking about what I would say to you if I was standing here. None of it feels like the right thing now. What did you think you'd say? She said. 17 different versions, he said, varying in length and emotional register. Try one, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fog moved off the sound. A gull appeared above the water briefly and disappeared back into the gray. I took something from you, he said. The night in the parking garage. Not just the 3 weeks. The certainty you'd built around your professional life. The control you'd constructed over your own circumstances. I walked into that and used it, and I understood what I was using when I did it, and I did it anyway. He held her gaze. Cooperation agreement, the restructured authorization, the evidence I'm not presenting those as payment for what I took. I know they don't work that way. I know that. He stopped. The fog was very close to the water. I wanted to be someone different in your story. I don't know if that's possible from the position I'm in. She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was running something through its full analysis before she spoke, not calculating, just thorough. He'd learned to recognize that too. He'd learned a great many things about how she thought during 3 weeks of working beside her, and then spent a year on the other side of a wall, adding to the collection. It's not about being different, she said. That's not how people work, and you know it. You were the person who took me from that parking garage, and you were the person who rebuilt the authorization structure, because you decided I mattered more than the operations design. And you were the person who stood in your entrance hall in front of Cormac Delaney and told him the truth because telling the truth had become more important to you than any of the outcomes that surviving that conversation would have produced. She held his gaze without flinching. That's all that's in person, Tae-hyun. I'm not asking you to separate those things. I spent the past year doing the work of holding all of it together, and I've done it, and I'm still here. The last 3 words landed simply. He felt them with a specificity that surprised him, which was itself a piece of information about who he was. Now that things could arrive and surprise him, that the armor that had once processed incoming information into operational data before letting it reach anything interior had gotten significantly thinner over the past year, or possibly been stripped down to almost nothing by the processes of the preceding period. I don't have anything, he said, the way I had things before. The companies still running are under independent management. The estate is gone. I have a consulting firm, 2 clients, a rental apartment. He looked at her directly. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because you knew a version of me that had all of it, and I need you to know that standing here without it doesn't. I expected it to feel like an amputation. Doesn't. How does it feel, she said. He thought about it. He'd become better at thinking about things before answering them. Accurate, he said. Like the life I'm describing from the outside actually matches something interior for the first time. He paused. I was the man who controlled everything around him, and it was a performance for an audience that included myself. And this is whatever this is. It's not a performance. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I can tell. She reached into her jacket pocket and adjusted something, the gesture of a person who is giving their hands something to do while they decide how much of what they're thinking to say out loud. I have a referral for you. A non-profit with distribution irregularities. The financial side is within my practice area, but the logistics chain isn't. You know port operations and freight infrastructure better than anyone I could hire for it. He looked at her. I'm not offering it because of this, she said, and the small gesture of her hand between them indicated the pier and the fog and the thing they were both standing in the middle of. I'm offering it because you'd be genuinely useful, and I don't give work to people because I like them. I give it to people because they're good at what I need. I know, he said. That's always been true about you. So, she said. So, he said. The quiet between them on the pier was different from the silences at the estate. Those had always had the weight of the situation in them, the operation, the guards, the surveillance monitors, the looming midnight transfer, all the structural pressure of circumstances neither of them had chosen. The sodding. This was just two people on a waterfront on a November morning, with fog and distance and a year's worth of consequence between them, deciding what they were going to do with the space. What do you actually want from this? He said. Not the referral. From this. Whatever this is. She didn't rush it. He appreciated that she didn't rush it. I want to find out if the person you are now, without the empire, without the operation, without anything to protect or manage or control, is someone I can build something with. She looked at him with the direct, clear attention that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her in the conference room at the estate. The quality of looking at something and actually seeing, rather, something than seeing what was useful to see. I'm not talking about quickly. I'm not talking about cleanly. I have no interest in clean. Clean is what people want when they're afraid of what the real thing looks like. She paused. I'm talking about real, which means slow and imperfect and with the full weight of everything that happened, not a version of events that makes the story more comfortable. Real is harder, he said. I've been doing it for a year, she said. You're behind. Something moved through him that was adjacent to laughter. He could feel it in his chest, the unfamiliar loosening of something that had been held tightly for a long time. He'd experienced this in the estate, too, those moments when she said something that arrived sideways to everything he'd been expecting and created an involuntary response he hadn't managed in time to prevent. I'll catch up, he said. I know you will, she said. She closed the distance between them. Not dramatically, just a step. Then another, the deliberate reduction of the careful gap she'd been maintaining, which he recognized as choice rather than drift. She was someone who drifted toward nothing. Every position she took was a position she'd decided to take. She took his hand. It was not like the moment in the working room, which had been electric and frightened and full of the pressure of everything surrounding it. This was slower, the deliberate certain contacts of someone who had thought through all the reasons not to do something and arrived at the conclusion that the reasons for were more true. His hand closed around hers. They stood on the pier for a while. Just stood. The fog moved over the sound, and the ferry horns reached them from the direction of the terminal, low and carrying, and the city existed at its ordinary volume behind them, indifferent and persistent. He thought about the parking garage. He thought about the estate and the operation and the 3 weeks in the working room and the entrance hall and the server room and all the things that had led to this pier on this November morning. He thought about his brother. He thought about the specific hard fact that some things couldn't be undone and that living with the undoable required a different kind of strength than the kind he'd spent his adult life cultivating. He thought, I am still the man who took her from that parking garage. I will always be that man. And I am also the man standing on this pier, holding her hand and learning at 41 years old what it means to be in a place without needing to control its outcome. He thought both things were going to be true simultaneously for the rest of his life. He thought that was the actual condition of being a person who had done serious damage and was trying to live forward from it without pretending the damage hadn't occurred. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She'd learned, at the estate, that he processed things internally first, and the external version came later, when it had been properly understood, and she'd stopped trying to intercept the processes in state sometime around the second week. After a while, she said, the referral is real. The nonprofit is a food distribution organization. They have 3 regional warehouses and a volunteer logistics coordinator who doesn't know what he's doing. When, he said. I was going to call them this week, she said. I can introduce you as a logistic consultant. I'm bringing in for the supply chain review. All right, he said. You'll need to bill them, she said. Don't do it for free. They'll respect the work more if they pay for it. I know how consulting works, he said. You know how criminal consulting works, she said. Legitimate is slightly different. How different? The invoices are simpler, she said, but you have to issue them yourself. He looked at her. Junho used to handle the invoicing, he said. Junho is not here, she said. I know where he is, he said. Don't, she said. He almost smiled. The pier was quiet around them. The fog was beginning, very slowly, to thin at the edges, not clearing. Seattle November being what it was, but loosening its grip slightly, the way weather loosens its grip, eventually, on everything it's been holding. They walked back along the waterfront, eventually. Not toward anything specific, just walking. The city moving around them at its ordinary pace, the sound visible through gaps between buildings, the cold, steady, and clean. She talked about the nonprofit referral, the preliminary findings on the distribution chain, what she thought the logistics problem actually was underneath the surface symptoms. He listened and asked questions that were specific and technically grounded and demonstrated a knowledge of freight operations that was genuinely useful. And she noted this with the part of her mind that was always taking notes. Not because she needed to document it, but because it was true, and truth was what she tracked. C's. He talked about the Thursday meeting with the logistics consulting firm, what he was hoping to establish in the first conversation, where he thought the practice could develop if the initial clients were the right ones. She listened and offered 2 observations that changed his thinking on the approach, and he incorporated them without ceremony, because her thinking was good, and incorporating good thinking was not a concession but a competency. It was the most ordinary conversation he'd had in as long as he could remember. That was the thing he couldn't entirely explain to himself, how the ordinary had come to feel like the most precious category of experience. He'd had years of the extraordinary resources, extraordinary risk, extraordinary control over the circumstances of his life and the lives of people connected to him. He'd built the extraordinary deliberately and maintained it with significant effort, and it had felt most of that period like the correct condition of existence for a man of his particular capabilities. Now he was on a waterfront in Seattle talking about freight, distribution, and billing practices with a woman who had once been his prisoner and was currently holding his hand, and it felt more real than any of it. He thought his brother would have found this funny. Tae-Soo had always found him funny, the seriousness, the control, the elaborate structures he built around every aspect of his life. He'd laughed at it with the easy affection of a younger sibling who'd decided that his brother was endearingly ridiculous in specific ways and loved him completely despite, or possibly because of those ways. He missed him. That was a fact he'd been carrying for over a year now, learning how it fit into the regular architecture of a day, not an emergency, not an acute thing, just a persistent presence in the space where a person used to be. He would keep missing him. There wasn't a resolution for that. Convictions in soul were justice, not repair, and he understood the distinction clearly. What he had was the knowledge that the people responsible had been named and held to account, and that the naming had happened through legitimate means, and that his own hands not clean, not ever completely clean, but reaching for something different had contributed to making it possible. That was what he had. He was learning that it was enough to keep moving forward. Imani's house was south of the city, 20 minutes by car. She had a car now, a practical one, 3 years old, nothing remarkable. She drove with the focus she brought to everything, and he sat in the passenger seat and looked at the water appearing and disappearing between buildings and felt, for the first time, the particular texture of being a passenger in someone else's competence and finding it not diminishing but restful. The house was small and sat on a slight rise above the water. She'd bought it impractically. She'd told him too much for what she needed, the view the deciding factor over every sensible consideration. He understood this better than she might have expected him to. He'd built an empire partly because of what the waterfront looked like from a specific angle, the specific quality of light on the sound on certain mornings. The beauty of a place was not a trivial reason for the decisions you made around it. She made coffee. Real coffee. Good coffee. She'd gotten particular about this, she said, sometime in the past year. A sound like which was the kind of small concrete change that happened to people when their lives shifted enough that the details started mattering differently. Sits. He sat at the kitchen table, and watched her move through the space with the comfort of someone who had made peace with her own company and wasn't looking for it to be supplemented but was willing to let it be extended. "Your associate," he said. "Tell me about her." She brought both cups to the table. Sat across from him. 26, University of Washington. Precise and underestimated, which is a useful combination in this work. Catches things in the second pass that I miss in the first, which is why I hired her. "You miss things in the first pass," he said. "Everyone does," she said. "The point is knowing that and building for it." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "She reminds me of myself 8 years ago, which is both a recommendation and a reason to keep watching. 8 years ago, I had the skills and not enough experience with what people will do to obscure the truth from someone with the skills." "She'll learn," he said. "She will," Imani said. "I'm going to make sure of it." He looked at her across the table. The fog was still pressed against the windows, but the light had changed November afternoon light, lower and more amber than morning, the specific quality that appeared for a few hours between the gray of the day and the dark of the evening. Came through the window behind her and sat on the kitchen table between them like a third presence. "I didn't plan to be this," he said. Not a non sequitur, she'd know what he meant. "I know," she said. "I planned to be what I was," he said. "The empire, the operation that was a plan, executed deliberately. I didn't drift into it. I know that too," she said. She wasn't softening it. She was just receiving it accurately. "So when people talk about starting over," he said, "I'm skeptical of the framing. Because I didn't accidentally become what I was. I chose it systematically over many years. The idea that I just begin again, clean slate, feels like a story people tell to make change seem easier than it is." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think it's a clean slate," she said. "I've never believed in that. You carry what you did. You carry it every day, incorporated into the person, making the next decision and the next one." She looked at him directly. "The question isn't whether you're starting over. The question is whether the decisions you make from here are the decisions of the person you're trying to become." She paused. "I've watched you make a series of those decisions under very high-pressure conditions. That's more evidence than most people get." "It's not sufficient evidence," he said. "No," she said. "It's a beginning." He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window and the fog and the water visible below the fog in the late afternoon light. "My brother would have liked you," he said. She was still for a moment. "Then tell me about him." He looked at her. "Not the circumstances," she said. "Him, who he was." He was quiet for a long moment. The habit of not talking about Tae-soo, not the grief, not the person, keeping both compressed and functional rather than expressed, had been in place for so long that dismantling it required active effort. He could feel the effort required. "He was funny," he said. "Not the way people who try to be funny are funny." Quietly. He'd say one thing in the middle of a serious conversation, and it would land 3 seconds later, and you'd realize it was the most accurate observation in the room. He paused. He played gaegeum, traditional Korean zither. He'd been studying since he was 9 years old. He had a teacher in Seoul who said he was going to be exceptional, and he was embarrassed about that, being told he was exceptional, which I found that genuinely difficult to understand. That someone could have that and be embarrassed by it. "It's different when it's your own," she said. "From the inside, it just feels like the thing you do." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think that's right." Coffee was getting cooler. The light was shifting. The water below the window had gone from silver to the deeper gray of late afternoon. The fog sitting lower now, the boundary between water and air less defined. He had a performance scheduled, Tae-hyun said, 3 weeks after he died. Concert series in Seoul. He'd been preparing for 6 months. He set the cup down. The hall released a statement when it was canceled. They said he was an extraordinary talent whose contributions to the form would be long remembered. He was quiet for a moment. He was 27 years old. He hadn't had enough time to make contributions. He'd had enough time to show that he would. Imani didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned a long time ago that sorry was what you said when you needed to say something, and sorry was inadequate to the actual weight of the loss, and she'd decided that inadequate things said in place of silence weren't better than silence. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked at it, looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "for the hand, and for the silence, and for asking about Tae-soo as a person rather than as a reason for an operation, and for all of it, the back door she'd built, the transmission she'd sent, the thing she'd done in that server room when she refused to give Graham what he needed, for the year of building something with her name on it, for the pier this morning and the house with the impractical view, and the coffee and the question, 'Tell me about him.'" "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." They sat there as the afternoon moved toward evening, and the water went darker and the fog settled in for the night, the way fog does in Seattle, in November, patient and complete, covering everything without urgency. This was not a clean resolution. Both of them understood that. There was no version of what had happened between them that could be made clean. The parking garage was always going to be the parking garage. The estate was always going to be what it was. The 3 weeks were not going to be transformed by whatever came after into something more comfortable to look at. Past was the past in its full weight, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. What they had instead was this kitchen, this table, and a view of the sound that she'd bought impractically and that he looked at now and understood completely. A sound, a nonprofit referral, and a Thursday meeting, and a junior associate who caught things in the second pass, and a consulting practice finding its footing. They had the evidence she'd built and transmitted, and the cooperation he'd given, and the convictions that had resulted. And a man in some soul who had been held accountable for a parking structure, and a musician, and all the life that had existed and been interrupted on that specific night. A sound like green wood splitting. They had the truth of what they'd done, both the damage and the reaching towards something better, carried together, because that was the only way to carry it. Tae-hyun thought about the armored SUV, and the estate, and the empire, and all the things he'd built to ensure that he would never have to be in a position where the outcome was out of his control. He thought about sitting on a bench in the November fog this morning, waiting without a plan, which he had not done since he was a young man in a different country, before he'd decided that waiting without a plan was too dangerous a position to occupy. He thought, "I am learning what it means to be in a place, without needing to manage its conclusion." He thought, this is what she asked for, real and slow and imperfect. With the full weight, he thought, "I can do this. I am not certain of many things, but I am certain of this." Imani stood eventually, and went to the window and looked at the water. He joined her. They stood side by side and watched the sound go dark, and the first lights of the city appear in the fog, not dramatic. Just the ordinary way cities announce themselves against nightfall, practical and persistent. "I'm making dinner," she said. "Not the thing from last week," he said, without knowing what the thing from last week was. She turned and looked at him. "Jun-ho," she said. "Jun-ho keeps exactly what he decides to keep,"
he said.
She shook her head, but the corner of her mouth was doing the thing, not the half version, the real one. The full arrival of something that hadn't been caught in time. He watched it happen. And for the first time in his life, Kwon Tae-hyun, who had once controlled a waterfront empire and filled every room he entered with the weight of managed consequence, stood in a small kitchen in November and let something good arrive without trying to own it. Let it be what it was. Let it stay because it chose to. That was the whole of it. That was enough.